The silence in room 237 was deafening as Ms. Angela Thompson's foot connected with the classroom door, the thunderous crack echoing through Lincoln High School's main hallway. What had started as cruel taunts during morning roll call would spiral into a federal investigation that would expose decades of institutional racism, destroy political careers, and send multiple people to prison. The students who thought they could break the new black teacher because she seemed too nice had no idea they were about to face a third-degree black belt who'd spent years learning that sometimes the only language bullies understand is the one spoken with perfect technique and unwavering resolve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Angela Thompson had faced racism before, but nothing quite like the systematic cruelty that awaited her at Lincoln High School. At 28, she possessed the rare combination of academic brilliance and street wisdom that came from growing up in Detroit's toughest neighborhoods. Her English literature degree from Michigan State had been earned through midnight study sessions between her mother's chemotherapy treatments, and her teaching certification represented not just personal achievement, but generational progress. What her students didn't know was that Angela had also spent 15 years perfecting Shotokan karate, earning her third-degree black belt under Sensei Williams, a man who taught that martial arts wasn't about violence, but about inner strength, discipline, and knowing when to stand your ground. The suburbs of Riverside, Ohio, had seemed like a fresh start when she accepted the position at Lincoln High. The school district's recruitment materials had painted a picture of diversity initiatives and inclusive education, but the reality Angela discovered was far different. Lincoln High was a fortress of privilege disguised as a public institution, where certain families wielded influence that transcended normal educational boundaries, and where teachers of color were expected to be grateful for their positions, while enduring treatment that would have sparked lawsuits in any other profession. Her first week had been a masterclass in microaggressions. Other teachers spoke to her slowly, assuming she might not understand educational terminology. Parents questioned her qualifications during back-to-school night, asking if she'd actually attended college or if she was part of some diversity program. Students tested boundaries constantly, refusing to follow simple classroom rules while watching for her reaction. But it was Jake Mitchell who would prove to be her greatest challenge, and, ultimately, the catalyst for everything that followed. Jake was 17, but carried himself with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His father owned the largest construction company in 3 counties, his mother sat on the school board, and his older brother had been Lincoln High's star quarterback before earning a full ride to Ohio State. Jake embodied the particular brand of entitlement that came from knowing your family name could open doors, erase mistakes, and silence critics. He was handsome in that all-American way that made teachers overlook his cruelty, intelligent enough to avoid getting caught in obvious wrongdoing, and charismatic enough to rally others to his cause. The morning of October 3rd started like any other. Angela arrived at 6:30, an hour before most teachers, to prepare her lessons and grade papers in the quiet sanctuary of her classroom. She'd learned to appreciate these peaceful moments before the chaos of adolescent energy filled the hallways. Her lesson plans were meticulous, her bulletin boards inspirational, and her desk organized with military precision. She believed in creating an environment where every student could succeed, regardless of their background or previous academic performance. Room 237 was her domain, decorated with quotes from Maya. Liz responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She moved closer to his desk, not in an aggressive manner, but with the confident stride of someone who refused to be intimidated. Are you referring to my master's degree in English literature from Michigan State? My 4 years of student teaching in Detroit's most challenging schools? Or perhaps my certification in advanced pedagogical methods? The smirk on Jake's face wavered slightly. He'd expected her to become defensive, to stammer or show weakness that he could exploit further. Instead, she'd turned his attack into an opportunity to showcase her credentials. But Jake Mitchell hadn't become Lincoln High's most notorious bully by backing down at the first sign of resistance. I just think it's weird that they hired someone from Detroit to teach us, he continued, emphasizing the word Detroit as if it were a curse. I mean, what could you possibly teach us about real literature? Don't you think someone with more traditional experience would be better suited for advanced English? The coded language wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Detroit meant urban, which meant black, which meant inferior in Jake's worldview. Traditional meant white, which meant legitimate, which meant worthy of respect. Emma Rodriguez had her phone positioned perfectly to capture whatever happened next, while Tyler Brooks leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of someone who'd watched this game played many times before. Angela had faced this particular brand of racism throughout her academic career. In college, professors had assumed her papers were plagiarized because they were too sophisticated. During job interviews, she'd been asked if she could quote, relate to diverse student populations, as if her race automatically made her a specialist in working with troubled youth rather than a qualified educator. At previous schools, parents had requested their children be moved to more experienced teachers the moment they discovered her identity, but Lincoln High represented something different. This wasn't just individual prejudice, but institutional protection of that prejudice. The school administration had recruited her as part of their diversity initiative, using her credentials and background to check boxes for state compliance, while quietly ensuring that the existing power structure remained untouched. They wanted the appearance of inclusion without the reality of change, a black teacher they could point to in brochures while maintaining the same exclusionary practices that had defined the district for decades. "You know what I think is interesting, Jake?" Angela said, perching on the edge of his desk with casual confidence. "I think you're operating under some fascinating assumptions. You seem to believe that geographic location determines intellectual capacity, that skin color correlates with competence, and that your opinion on my qualifications matters more than the credentials I earned through years of study and practice." She could see other students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked embarrassed by Jake's behavior, while others appeared excited by the brewing confrontation. Madison Clark was recording with a second phone, ensuring multiple angles of whatever happened next. Tyler Brooks had straightened up, no longer lounging but sitting at attention like a soldier awaiting orders. "Let me share something with you about my background," Angela continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a master teacher who knew how to command attention. "I grew up in a neighborhood where drive-by shootings were background noise and where most of my classmates didn't graduate high school. I studied by candlelight when the electricity was turned off, wrote essays on napkins when we couldn't afford paper, and walked 2 miles to the public library because knowledge was the only way out of poverty." The room had gone completely silent. Even Jake seemed momentarily caught off guard by her directness, by her willingness to own her story rather than apologize for it. "I earned my bachelor's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Degree with a 4.0 GPA while working 3 jobs to support my family. I spent my summers teaching literacy to children in homeless shelters, my evenings tutoring high school dropouts for their GED exams, and my weekends volunteering at community centers where education was seen as luxury rather than a right." So when you ask about my background, Jake, you're asking about someone who fought for every opportunity you've been handed since birth. The silence stretched, heavy with tension and unspoken truths. Angela could see the calculation happening behind Jake's eyes, the realization that his usual tactics weren't working as planned. But she also recognized something more dangerous, the particular rage that came when privileged individuals were forced to confront their assumptions. "That's a really inspiring story," Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But this isn't Detroit. This is Lincoln High School, where we have standards. Maybe you should consider whether you're really the right fit for our community." The word "our" hung in the air like a territorial marking. Our community, our school, our standards. The message was clear. She was an outsider, an interloper in a space that belonged to people like him. Emma Rodriguez zoomed in with her phone, capturing the moment of confrontation that she planned to edit and share across social media platforms. Angela felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same energy that had fueled her through years of training in Sensei Williams' dojo. He'd taught her that martial arts wasn't about physical technique alone, but about mental discipline, about knowing when to strike and when to wait, about understanding that true strength came from controlling your power rather than unleashing it recklessly. "You're absolutely right that this isn't Detroit," she replied, moving to the front of the classroom where she could address the entire room. "Detroit taught me that education is a privilege that shouldn't be wasted, that every student deserves a teacher who believes in their potential, and that excellence isn't determined by zip code or family income. If those aren't the standards you're used to at Lincoln High, then perhaps it's time for this community to raise its expectations." She could see Principal Hayes passing by in the hallway, his eyes briefly meeting hers through the door's window before he quickly looked away. The administration's pattern was becoming clear. recruit diverse faculty for appearance's sake, then abandon them when conflicts arose with influential families. She was expected to absorb the abuse silently, to be grateful for the position while accepting treatment that would never be tolerated if directed at white colleagues. Jake wasn't finished. He'd built his reputation on breaking teachers, on finding their weak spots and exploiting them until they either quit or learned to look the other way when he targeted other students. Angela's refusal to be intimidated wasn't just personally frustrating. It was a threat to the entire social order he'd spent years constructing. "Maybe the problem isn't our standards," he said, standing up so he towered over her desk. "Maybe the problem is that you don't understand your place here. This isn't some inner-city school where you can lower expectations and call it success. These students are going to Ivy League universities, not community college." The racist implications were now impossible to ignore. Jake had moved beyond coded language into explicit statements about her inferiority, her unfitness to teach students he deemed superior. Tyler Brooks nodded approvingly, while Madison Clark made sure her recording captured every word. Emma Rodriguez was practically vibrating with excitement, already composing captions for the viral video she planned to create. Angela looked around the room at faces that ranged from uncomfortable to eager, from ashamed to anticipatory. These were 17 and 18-year-old students who were learning lessons that went far beyond English literature. They were absorbing messages about power, privilege, and who deserved respect in American society. Some would carry these lessons into positions of authority, becoming the next generation of administrators, executives, and leaders who would perpetuate the same systems of exclusion. "You know what, Jake?" Angela said, her voice carrying a new quality that made several students sit up straighter. "I think you've made your position very clear. You believe that my race disqualifies me from teaching students like you. You think my background makes me inferior to the teachers you're accustomed to. And you assume that your family's position in this community gives you the right to determine who belongs here." She moved toward the whiteboard, picking up a marker with deliberate precision. "Since you're so concerned about standards, let's establish some classroom expectations that everyone can understand." What happened next would be replayed thousands of times across social media platforms, analyzed by legal experts, and used as evidence in federal court proceedings. But in that moment, it felt like time slowed to a crawl, as Jake Mitchell made a decision that would destroy his family's reputation and expose Lincoln High School's culture of protected cruelty. Angela had turned to write on the whiteboard when she heard the scraping of a chair being pushed back aggressively. Jake's voice cut through the classroom air with a venom that made several students gasp audibly. "Nobody wants to hear your ghetto standards, lady. Why don't you go back to the hood where you belong and stop pretending you can teach real students?" The racial slur that followed was captured in perfect clarity by Emma Rodriguez's iPhone, along with the shocked expressions of students who hadn't expected Jake to cross that particular line. Even Tyler Brooks looked uncomfortable, recognizing that his friend had just escalated beyond typical bullying into territory that could have serious consequences. Angela froze at the whiteboard, marker still in hand, processing what had just occurred. In 15 years of education, she'd faced subtle racism, systemic discrimination, and countless microaggressions, but never had a student used explicit racial language in front of an entire class. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Emma's finger tapping her phone screen as she saved the recording to multiple cloud storage accounts. "What did you just say?" Angela asked, turning slowly to face Jake. Her voice was dangerously quiet, carrying the kind of controlled fury that anyone who'd trained in martial arts would recognize as the moment before action. Jake, emboldened by what he perceived as her shock and perhaps sensing that he'd already crossed the point of no return, doubled down on his attack. "You heard me. This is our school, our community, and we don't need some diversity hire coming in here acting like she owns the place. Your kind never lasts here anyway. Ask Mrs. Washington how that worked out for her." The reference to Mrs. Washington sent a chill through the classroom. 3 years earlier, Diana Washington had been Lincoln High's first black mathematics teacher, recruited with great fanfare and promotional materials about the district's commitment to inclusion. She'd lasted exactly 1 semester before transferring to another district, citing personal reasons that everyone suspected were anything but personal. The rumor mill had whispered about hostile parents, unsupportive administration, and students who made her life miserable, but the official story remained that she'd simply found a better opportunity elsewhere. Madison Clark zoomed in with her secondary recording device, ensuring she captured Angela's facial expression at the moment of the attack. She'd already mentally composed the social media posts that would frame this confrontation as evidence of an unqualified teacher losing control, conveniently editing out Jake's racist language while highlighting any reaction that could be painted as unprofessional. Angela felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that Sensei Williams had taught her to recognize and channel. Years of training had conditioned her to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically even when emotions ran high, and to understand that the most powerful response was often the most unexpected one. Jake expected her to yell, to send him to the principal's office, or to break down in tears like so many targets of his cruelty had done before. Instead, Angela set down her marker with deliberate precision and walked calmly to her desk. She opened her laptop, navigated to the district's harassment reporting portal, and began typing while the entire class watched in stunned silence. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, documenting the incident in real time while the details were fresh and witnesses were present. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded, his confidence beginning to waver as he realized this wasn't playing out according to his usual script. "I'm filing a formal complaint for racial harassment, creation of a hostile learning environment, and violation of the district's code of conduct," Angela replied without looking up from her screen. "I'm also documenting the presence of recording devices and the deliberate nature of this attack." She continued typing, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism she'd used to discuss a homework assignment. "The district policy clearly states that racial slurs constitute grounds for immediate suspension pending investigation. Since this incident was recorded and witnessed by 23 students, there shouldn't be much ambiguity about what occurred." The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted dramatically. Students who'd been eagerly anticipating a meltdown were now witnessing something entirely different. A teacher who refused to be rattled, who understood the system well enough to use it against her attackers, and who possessed the documentation skills to build an airtight case. Emma Rodriguez stopped recording, suddenly realizing that her viral video might not paint the picture she'd intended. Tyler Brooks slumped in his seat, recognizing that his association with Jake's outburst could jeopardize his basketball scholarship opportunities. Madison Clark discreetly deleted her backup recording, calculating that being connected to explicit racism might damage her family's pharmaceutical business reputation. But Jake wasn't finished. Like many bullies who'd never faced real consequences, he interpreted Angela's measured response as weakness rather than strength. "You can file all the complaints you want," he sneered. "My mom sits on the school board. My dad employs half this town, and everyone knows you're just here because of some quota system. Who do you think they're going to believe?" Angela finally looked up from her laptop, and Jake took an involuntary step backward. Her expression wasn't angry or hurt or intimidated. It was the look of someone who'd just been handed exactly what they needed to win a much larger battle. "You know what, Jake? You're absolutely right about one thing," she said, standing and moving around her desk with fluid grace. "This is about power, about who gets believed, about who gets protected when they do harm to others. But I think you fundamentally misunderstood how power actually works in the 21st century." She gestured toward the phones that had captured his outburst. "See, your father's construction company depends on federal contracts that require compliance with equal opportunity employment standards. Your mother's position on the school board is subject to state oversight that takes civil rights violations very seriously. And Lincoln High School receives significant federal funding that comes with strict requirements about maintaining inclusive learning environments." The color was beginning to drain from Jake's face as he realized the implications of what she was saying. He'd grown up in a bubble where his family's local influence seemed omnipotent, where problems disappeared with the right phone call or donation check. But Angela was describing a world of federal regulations, legal accountability, and consequences that existed beyond his father's sphere of influence. Furthermore, Angela continued, her teacher instincts taking over as she recognized a teachable moment. Social media has created a new kind of accountability. Emma's recording doesn't just exist on her phone. It's already been backed up to cloud servers, automatically saved to multiple platforms, and potentially shared with networks far beyond Lincoln High School. Once something goes viral, no amount of local influence can make it disappear. She moved closer to Jake's desk, and he found himself leaning backward despite his attempts to maintain defiance. "But here's what really makes this interesting, Jake. I didn't come to Lincoln High School alone. I'm part of a network of educators who've been documenting exactly these kinds of incidents across the district. Your outburst isn't an isolated event. It's part of a pattern that we've been carefully tracking and recording. The revelation hit the classroom like a thunderbolt. Students exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that their new teacher wasn't the isolated target they'd assumed. Tyler Brooks remembered rumors about other teachers leaving under mysterious circumstances, while Madison Clark recalled her parents' complaints about activist educators trying to change the district's culture. Angela returned to her laptop and pulled up a folder labeled Lincoln High Documentation Project. The screen displayed a spreadsheet with dozens of entries: dates, times, names, descriptions of incidents, and witness information. She'd been building a comprehensive record since her first day, documenting everything from subtle microaggressions to overt hostility. Every dismissive comment from administrators, every parent who questioned my qualifications based on my appearance, every student who tested boundaries they'd never test with white teachers, she said, scrolling through the meticulously organized data. It's all been documented, cross-referenced, and backed up in multiple locations. Jake's bravado finally cracked completely. He'd expected to humiliate another teacher into submission, to reassert his dominance in a space he'd always controlled. Instead, he'd walked into what amounted to a carefully laid trap, providing the kind of explicit evidence that his previous victims had never been able to gather. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's your word against mine, and everyone knows how this works around here." Angela smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and it wasn't an expression of warmth or friendship. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards and was about to reveal a winning hand. "Actually, Jake, that's where you're wrong again," she said, clicking to another tab on her laptop. "Because this entire conversation has been recorded by the classroom security system, which streams directly to the district's central monitoring station. Everything you've said, every slur you've used, every threat you've made, has been automatically saved to servers that are completely outside Lincoln High School's local control." The revelation struck the room like lightning. Students who'd assumed they were witnesses to a private confrontation suddenly realized they'd been participants in a recorded event that would be preserved permanently. Emma Rodriguez frantically checked her phone settings, wondering if there was any way to delete her contribution to the evidence pile. Tyler Brooks stared at the ceiling-mounted camera he'd never noticed before, calculating how his passive support of Jake's racism would play in college recruitment meetings. But it was Jake who suffered the most dramatic transformation. The confident bully who'd strutted into class that morning was replaced by a pale, shaking teenager who finally understood that his actions would have consequences beyond his father's ability to fix. He'd spent years believing that his family's position made him untouchable, only to discover that he'd just provided irrefutable evidence of behavior that could destroy everything he'd taken for granted. Angela closed her laptop with quiet finality and looked around the classroom at faces that ranged from shocked to terrified to grudgingly impressed. "Now then," she said, her voice returning to the warm professionalism she'd displayed before Jake's attack. "Shall we discuss today's reading assignment, or would anyone else like to share their thoughts about my qualifications?" The rest of first period passed in uncomfortable silence, with students stealing glances between their textbooks and the front of the room where Angela continued teaching as if nothing had happened. Her calm demeanor in the aftermath of Jake's racist tirade was perhaps more unsettling to her attackers than any emotional outburst would have been. By the time the bell rang, word had already begun spreading through Lincoln High's hallways that something significant had occurred in room 237. Angela watched her students file out, noting how Jake avoided eye contact while Emma Rodriguez clutched her phone like a lifeline. Tyler Brooks lingered momentarily, as if considering an apology, but ultimately followed his friends into the corridor without saying a word. Madison Clark was already typing furiously on her device, likely coordinating damage control strategies with her social media network. Before Angela could gather her thoughts, Principal Hayes appeared in her doorway. Robert Hayes was a man whose entire career had been built on avoiding difficult decisions, on maintaining the delicate balance between academic standards and community expectations that kept Lincoln High functioning smoothly. At 52, he possessed the particular brand of administrative cowardice that allowed serious problems to fester, while focusing obsessively on minor infractions that were easier to address. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone delivering bad news while pretending it was good. "I understand there was some sort of disruption in your class this morning. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" Angela recognized the tone immediately. This wasn't an offer but a command disguised as a request. The kind of administrative manipulation designed to make subordinates feel they had choices when they actually had none. She'd seen this pattern before at her previous schools, where principals would summon teachers to private meetings where complaints could be reframed as misunderstandings, and victims could be convinced that reporting incidents would only make things worse. "Certainly," Angela replied, saving her lesson plans and gathering her documentation folder. "I was actually planning to request a meeting myself. There are several policy violations we need to address immediately." The walk to Principal Hayes' office provided a tour of Lincoln High's carefully cultivated image of excellence. Trophy cases lined the hallways, showcasing decades of academic and athletic achievements. Framed photographs depicted smiling students and faculty, though Angela noticed that diversity seemed to decrease significantly in older images. The walls were adorned with plaques recognizing major donors, including a prominent display honoring the Mitchell family's contributions to the school's technology infrastructure. Hayes' office reflected his personality perfectly: safe, conventional, and designed to avoid controversy. The furniture was standard institutional issue, the decorations were generic motivational posters, and the bookshelf contained education management texts, rather than literature or academic works. This was the office of someone who viewed education as a business operation rather than a transformative endeavor. "Please, have a seat," Hayes said, settling behind his desk with the careful positioning of someone who understood that physical space reinforced authority relationships. "I've received some concerning reports about what happened in your classroom this morning. Several parents have already called expressing worry about the learning environment." Angela remained standing, a decision that clearly made Hayes uncomfortable. Which parents exactly? And what specific concerns did they express? Because if they're calling about their children's use of racial slurs in my classroom, I share their concerns and would welcome their support in addressing this behavior. Hayes shifted in his chair, his discomfort becoming more apparent. Now, let's not jump to conclusions about what actually occurred. Students sometimes say things they don't mean, especially when they feel challenged or overwhelmed. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding that we could resolve through dialogue rather than formal complaints. The pattern was becoming clear. Hayes had already decided to frame this incident as a communication breakdown rather than a civil rights violation, to treat Jake's explicitly racist language as teenage misbehavior rather than actionable harassment. This approach allowed the administration to avoid uncomfortable conversations with influential parents while maintaining the fiction that Lincoln High was an inclusive, welcoming environment. "Let me clarify something for you, Principal Hayes," Angela said, opening her documentation folder and placing several printed pages on his desk. "There was no misunderstanding. Jake Mitchell used explicit racial slurs directed at me personally, questioned my qualifications based solely on my race, and made statements suggesting that black educators don't belong at Lincoln High School. This occurred in front of 23 witnesses and was recorded both by students and by the classroom security system." Hayes glanced at the documents without really reading them, a habit that Angela recognized as deliberate avoidance. Administrators who didn't want to take action often refused to fully examine evidence, allowing them to later claim ignorance about the severity of incidents. "I'm sure Jake didn't intend any harm," he said weakly. "He's actually a very good student from a prominent family. His father has been extremely supportive of our programs over the years." The mention of parental donations was another telltale sign. Angela had seen this calculation before: weigh the inconvenience of addressing racism against the risk of losing financial support from wealthy families. In Hayes' moral universe, protecting institutional funding took precedence over protecting employees from harassment. "Principal Hayes," Angela said, her voice taking on the formal tone she reserved for official interactions, "I need you to understand something very clearly. What happened in my classroom this morning wasn't a personality conflict or a misunderstanding. It was a violation of federal civil rights law, state education regulations, and district harassment policies. Your response to this incident will determine whether Lincoln High School faces a complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights." Hayes finally looked up from the documents, his face pale, as he realized the conversation had moved beyond local politics into federal oversight territory. Like many small-town administrators, he'd grown accustomed to handling problems through informal networks and personal relationships. The prospect of federal investigation represented a level of scrutiny that could end careers in close institutions. "Surely we don't need to involve outside agencies," he said, his voice climbing in pitch. "We can handle this internally, maybe arrange some sensitivity training for the students involved. I'm sure the Mitchell family would be willing to make a donation for diversity programming if we could resolve this quietly." Angela almost laughed at the transparent attempt to buy her silence. The suggestion that racist harassment could be resolved through donation checks perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with Lincoln High's approach to accountability. You want the Mitchell family, whose son just used racial slurs against a faculty member, to fund diversity training? Do you understand how that sounds? She leaned forward, placing her hands on Hayes' desk with deliberate pressure. Let me explain what's going to happen next. I'm filing formal complaints with the district superintendent, the State Department of Education, and the Federal Office for Civil Rights. I'm documenting every aspect of this incident and your response to it. And I'm connecting with other educators who've experienced similar treatment at Lincoln High to establish a pattern of institutional discrimination. Hayes' face cycled through several shades of red before settling on an unhealthy purple. Ms. Thompson, I think you're overreacting to what amounts to teenage behavior. If you're not comfortable with the realities of working in this environment, perhaps you'd be happier at a different school. I could arrange a transfer to one of our urban campuses where you might feel more at home. The coded language was unmistakable. Urban meant black, which meant inferior, which meant where someone like Angela supposedly belonged. Hayes had just revealed his own prejudices while attempting to solve his problem by shipping her off to a school he clearly viewed as less important than Lincoln High. Angela pulled out her phone and set it to record, the device's red light clearly visible on Hayes' desk. Could you repeat that last statement for the record? Specifically the part about transferring me to an urban campus where I'd feel more at home? I want to make sure I have your exact words when I submit my documentation to federal investigators. Hayes reached across the desk as if to stop the recording, then caught himself and pulled back. You can't record me without permission! This is a private conversation! Actually, Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record any conversation I'm part of, Angela replied calmly. But your attempt to stop me from documenting your discriminatory statements is itself noteworthy. Would you like to explain why you don't want your words preserved for review? The power dynamic in the office had completely reversed. Hayes, who'd begun the meeting assuming he could pressure Angela into dropping her complaint, now found himself being interrogated by someone who clearly understood legal procedures better than he did. His usual tactics of intimidation and implied threats were useless against a target who refused to be intimidated. I think this meeting is over, Hayes said, standing abruptly and moving toward the door. I'll need to consult with the district's legal counsel before we continue this discussion. Angela remained seated, continuing to record as Hayes clearly wanted to end their conversation. That's an excellent idea. Please make sure legal counsel reviews the federal requirements for investigating civil rights complaints. They'll want to know that you've been informed of a hostile work environment and that your response will be evaluated for compliance with Title VII protections. She gathered her documentation folder and stood to leave, but paused at the door. Oh, and Principal Hayes? You might want to check with IT about preserving the security footage from this morning. Federal investigators take very seriously any attempts to delete or alter evidence once they've been notified of potential violations. As Angela walked back toward her classroom, she could hear Hayes frantically dialing his phone. The conversation she'd just recorded would become a crucial piece of evidence in the federal investigation that would ultimately expose Lincoln High's pattern of discrimination. But more immediately, it had established that the administration's default response was to protect perpetrators rather than address misconduct. Her second period class was already assembled when she returned, students buzzing with whispered conversations about the morning's events. Word had spread throughout the school with the speed that only teenage gossip networks could achieve, though the details had undoubtedly been distorted through multiple retellings. Some students looked at her with new respect, others with curiosity, and a few with the hostile suspicion that came from realizing their comfortable assumptions about power and privilege might be wrong. Angela set down her materials and looked around the room at faces that represented the next generation of community leaders, business owners, and decision-makers. What they learned in moments like this would shape their understanding of justice, accountability, and human dignity for decades to come. She had an opportunity to teach lessons that went far beyond English literature, to demonstrate that standing up to injustice was possible even when the odds seemed overwhelming. Good morning, everyone, she said, her voice carrying the same professional warmth she brought to every class. "I know there are probably rumors circulating about what happened earlier today. Rather than address speculation, I think this is a perfect opportunity to discuss the literature we've been reading and its relevance to contemporary social issues." She moved to the whiteboard and wrote a quote from James Baldwin. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Turning back to her students, she smiled with genuine enthusiasm for the teaching moment ahead. Who can tell me how this quotation relates to the themes we've identified in our current reading? The day continued with Angela maintaining her professional composure while documentation and evidence began accumulating behind the scenes. By lunch period, the video of Jake's racist outburst had spread beyond Lincoln High's student body and into the wider community. Emma Rodriguez had initially posted edited clips that made Angela appear confrontational while obscuring Jake's slurs, but other students had shared unedited versions that revealed the full context of the incident. The viral nature of the content caught the attention of civil rights organizations, education advocacy groups, and news outlets that specialized in institutional discrimination cases. Within hours, Angela's phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, attorneys, and activists who recognized the significance of having clear documentation of racist harassment in an educational setting. But it was the call from Mrs. Lisa Chen that changed everything. Lisa was a veteran teacher at Lincoln High who taught there for 12 years, watching a succession of diverse faculty members arrive with enthusiasm and leave broken and defeated. She'd maintained her position by keeping her head down, avoiding confrontation, and focusing solely on her mathematics curriculum while ignoring the systemic problems around her. "Miss Thompson," Lisa said when Angela answered her phone during her planning period, "I saw what happened this morning. I need to talk to you after school. There are things you need to know about this place. Things that go much deeper than what you experienced today." The meeting took place in Lisa's empty classroom, where she revealed a hidden folder containing photographs, emails, and handwritten notes, documenting years of discriminatory incidents at Lincoln High. She'd been quietly collecting evidence ever since the departure of Mrs. Washington, the black mathematics teacher whose sudden transfer had left Lisa as the only teacher of color in the building. "Diana Washington didn't leave for a better opportunity," Lisa explained, her hands shaking as she showed Angela printed emails between administrators discussing how to quote, handle the Washington problem. "She was systematically harassed by students whose parents complained that she was too strict, too demanding, too focused on academic rigor." Sound familiar? The documents revealed a pattern of deliberate targeting that went far beyond individual student behavior. Parents had organized letter-writing campaigns questioning diverse teachers' qualifications. Administrators had responded by increasing classroom observations, nitpicking lesson plans, and creating administrative burdens that were never imposed on white faculty members. Students had been subtly encouraged to challenge authority figures who didn't fit their expectations of what teachers should look like. "They made her life so miserable that she begged for a transfer," Lisa continued, showing Angela security footage that she'd secretly copied showing students vandalizing Diana's classroom while administrators walked past without intervening. But they were smart about it. Nothing was explicitly racial. Everything could be explained away as personality conflicts or cultural misunderstandings. Angela studied the documentation with growing understanding of how Lincoln High's discrimination operated. It was sophisticated, systemic, and designed to avoid the kind of explicit evidence that could trigger federal investigations. Jake's outburst that morning represented a breakdown in their usual methods, a moment when the mask slipped and revealed the ugly reality beneath. "Why are you showing me this?" Angela asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because you're different," Lisa replied. Diana was brilliant but gentle. She believed that excellence would be enough, that if she just worked harder and proved her worth, they'd eventually accept her. "You're not going to try to appease them, are you?" Angela looked at the evidence spread across Lisa's desk, understanding that she'd been handed the keys to dismantling Lincoln High's discriminatory culture. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." That evening, Angela sat in her apartment reviewing everything she'd learned while her sister Maria listened in growing outrage. Maria worked as a paralegal for a civil rights law firm in Cleveland and understood immediately the legal implications of what Angela had uncovered. "This isn't just harassment," Maria said, poring over the documents Lisa had provided. "This is a conspiracy to maintain racial segregation in public education. The federal government takes this stuff very seriously, especially when there's documented evidence of administrative complicity. She pulled out her laptop and began researching recent Department of Education investigations into similar cases. Look at this. Last year, a district in Pennsylvania lost $12 million in federal funding for exactly this kind of systematic discrimination. 3 administrators were fired, the school board was placed under federal oversight, and they had to implement comprehensive reform programs. Angela felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as she realized the scope of what she was contemplating. Taking on individual bullies was one thing, but challenging an entire institutional system was something else entirely. What about retaliation? They've already tried to pressure me into transferring. That's actually good for your case, Maria explained. Retaliation against someone filing civil rights complaints is a separate federal violation with its own penalties. Every time they try to silence you, they're digging themselves deeper. They spent the evening crafting a comprehensive strategy that would maximize Angela's protection while building the strongest possible case. Maria connected her with attorneys who specialized in education discrimination, helped her organize the evidence into categories that would be most useful for investigators, and advised her on additional documentation that would strengthen her position. The next morning, Angela arrived at Lincoln High to find the atmosphere dramatically changed. Students whispered and pointed as she walked through the hallways, some with admiration and others with hostility. Teachers avoided eye contact, clearly having received instructions about interacting with her. Principal Hayes was nowhere to be seen, though his secretary informed Angela that he was attending to district business and would be unavailable indefinitely. Her first period class was noticeably different. Jake Mitchell was absent, as were Tyler Brooks and Madison Clark. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, her usual phone nowhere in sight, looking uncomfortable and avoiding Angela's gaze. The remaining students seemed subdued, unsure how to navigate the new dynamic in their classroom. "Good morning, everyone," Angela said, noting the empty desks but choosing not to comment directly. "I know yesterday was eventful, but we have important work to do. Let's focus on our analysis of how authors use conflict to reveal character development." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. They were studying literature about characters who faced adversity and chose their responses, while their own teacher was providing a real-time example of someone who refused to be defeated by institutional pressure. During her planning period, Angela received a call from Detective James Parker of the Riverside Police Department. "Ms. Thompson, I'm calling about the incident you reported yesterday. We've received several complaints about the video that's been circulating, and I wanted to let you know that we're taking this very seriously." The police involvement represented an escalation that Angela hadn't anticipated. While she'd filed complaints with educational authorities, the viral nature of the video had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies that took hate crimes seriously. Detective Parker explained that Ohio had recently strengthened its hate crime statutes to include harassment based on race, especially in educational or workplace settings. "The video evidence is pretty clear," Parker continued. "We have a minor using racial slurs against a teacher in a public setting, with multiple witnesses and clear documentation. That meets the threshold for criminal hate crime charges, not just civil violations." Angela felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. While she wanted accountability, she also understood that criminal charges against a 17-year-old would have long-lasting consequences. "What does that mean for Jake Mitchell?" "Depends on how his family wants to handle it," Parker replied. "They can cooperate with our investigation and accept responsibility, which might result in community service and mandatory counseling. Or they can fight it, in which case we proceed with full prosecution under the hate crime statutes." The detective's call was followed by another from attorney Sarah Johnson, a civil rights lawyer who'd been contacted by Maria. Sarah had reviewed the evidence and was eager to take Angela's case on a pro bono basis, recognizing its potential to set important precedents for educator protection. "What you have here is extraordinary," Sarah explained during their phone conference. "Most discrimination cases rely on patterns of behavior that are difficult to prove conclusively. You have explicit racial harassment captured on video, administrative retaliation documented in real time, and evidence of systemic discrimination going back years. This is the kind of case that can create lasting change." Sarah outlined a legal strategy that would file complaints simultaneously with multiple agencies: the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Ohio Department of Education. This multi-pronged approach would ensure that Lincoln High faced oversight from federal, state, and local authorities, making it impossible for them to simply weather the storm and return to business as usual. "They'll try to settle quickly and quietly," Sarah warned. "They'll offer you money, better working conditions, maybe even a promotion to another district. But if you're serious about creating systemic change, we need to see this through to the end." Angela thought about Mrs. Washington, who'd been driven out before she could fight back, and about future teachers of color who might face the same treatment. "I'm not interested in settlements that allow the problem to continue. Let's do this." The legal machinery began moving with surprising speed. Within 48 hours of Sarah filing the initial complaints, Lincoln High received notification letters from 3 different oversight agencies announcing formal investigations. The school district's insurance company immediately assigned their top legal team to assess liability and potential damages. Local news outlets picked up the story, with the viral video providing perfect visual evidence of the issues at stake. But it was the community response that truly surprised Angela. While she'd expected resistance from some quarters, she hadn't anticipated the groundswell of support from parents, students, and community members who'd been waiting for someone to challenge Lincoln High's discriminatory culture. Maria Santos, whose daughter had graduated from Lincoln High 2 years earlier, contacted Angela to share her own family's experiences with discriminatory treatment. "They told my daughter she wasn't college material and steered her toward vocational programs even though she had a 3.8 GPA, Maria explained. "We knew it was wrong, but we didn't know how to fight it." Similar stories emerged from dozens of families who'd felt powerless to challenge a system that seemed designed to protect certain students while marginalizing others. Parents of color described being told their children were behavioral problems when they excelled academically, while LGBTQ students reported harassment that administrators had dismissed as normal teenage behavior. The documentation project that Angela and Lisa Chen had initiated expanded rapidly as more people came forward with evidence of systemic discrimination. What had started as an individual harassment case was evolving into a comprehensive investigation of how Lincoln High had maintained exclusionary practices while presenting itself as a model of educational excellence. Jake Mitchell returned to school 3 days after his initial outburst, accompanied by his parents and a high-powered attorney from Columbus who specialized in defending wealthy clients against discrimination charges. The Mitchell family had clearly decided to fight rather than accept responsibility, a decision that would prove to be catastrophically expensive. Angela first encountered Jake in the hallway between classes, where he was surrounded by a group of supporters who'd rallied to his defense. Some students had bought into the narrative that he was being unfairly persecuted for minor comments, while others genuinely believed that challenging their social hierarchy was wrong, regardless of the methods used. "Look, it's the teacher who can't take a joke," one of Jake's friends called out loud enough for Angela to hear. "Maybe if you weren't so sensitive, this wouldn't have blown up." Angela paused in the hallway, recognizing another teachable moment. Rather than ignore the comment or respond defensively, she turned to address the group directly. "I'm curious," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the corridor. "Which part of racial slurs directed at a faculty member do you consider humorous? I'd like to understand the joke so I can explain it to the federal investigators who'll be interviewing students next week." The mention of federal investigators caused an immediate shift in the group's energy. Students who'd been laughing moments before suddenly looked uncomfortable, realizing that their casual dismissal of racism might soon be scrutinized by serious adults with serious consequences at their disposal. Jake himself looked haggard, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who wasn't sleeping well. His family's legal strategy had become the talk of the community, with many residents questioning whether defending racial harassment was really the hill the Mitchells wanted to die on. "This is all blown out of proportion," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I never meant anything racial. People are just reading stuff into what I said that wasn't there." Angela smiled with the patience of a teacher addressing a student who was struggling with basic comprehension. "Jake, I have a recording of you using explicit racial slurs while telling me to go back to the hood where I belong. Which part of that statement do you think people are misinterpreting?" The hallway had filled with students and faculty who were listening to this exchange with fascination. This wasn't a private confrontation, but a public accounting that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Angela was demonstrating that racist behavior would be challenged directly, consistently, and without apology. "My lawyer says I shouldn't talk about this," Jake mumbled, looking to his friends for support that was no longer forthcoming. "That's excellent advice," Angela agreed. "You should definitely discuss your defense strategy with your legal team. I'm sure they'll explain how hate crime charges work in Ohio and what kind of penalties you might be facing." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "This is actually a perfect example of consequences in action. Jake made choices about how to treat people based on their race. Now he gets to experience the results of those choices. It's a very educational process." The federal investigation began in earnest the following week, with teams of investigators descending on Lincoln High to interview students, faculty, and administrators. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights sent their most experienced investigators, recognizing that this case had the potential to set important precedents for how educational institutions handle discrimination complaints. Angela found herself at the center of a media storm as news outlets across the country picked up the story. The combination of viral video evidence, systematic discrimination, and a teacher who refused to be silenced created a narrative that resonated far beyond Ohio's borders. Education reporters, civil rights advocates, and social justice organizations rallied to support her case. But it was the support from her students that meant the most to Angela. As the investigation proceeded, more young people found the courage to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination at Lincoln High. Students who'd been told they didn't belong, who'd been tracked into lower-level classes based on assumptions about their capabilities, who'd been subjected to harassment that administrators had ignored. Aisha Patel, a quiet senior who'd never spoken up in class, approached Angela after school one day with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for fighting back," she said. "I've been here for 4 years, and no one has ever stood up to them before. Watching you do it made me realize that I don't have to accept being treated like I'm less than everyone else." Similar conversations took place throughout the school as students who'd internalized discriminatory treatment began to understand that they deserved better. The investigation had created space for voices that had been silenced for years, and those voices were telling stories that painted a damning picture of Lincoln High's culture. The Mitchell family's legal strategy unraveled quickly under federal scrutiny. Their attorneys' attempts to frame Jake's behavior as protected speech failed when investigators revealed the broader pattern of harassment that had been documented by other students and faculty. Video evidence from security cameras showed multiple incidents where Jake and his friends had targeted students and teachers based on race, with administrators consistently failing to take appropriate action. More damaging was the discovery of social media communications where Jake and his friends had planned their attack on Angela, discussing specifically how to use racial language to humiliate her while avoiding consequences. The premeditated nature of the harassment elevated the charges from simple assault to conspiracy to violate civil rights, a federal felony that carried significant penalties. Principal Hayes' situation deteriorated even more rapidly. The recording Angela had made of their conversation became evidence of administrative retaliation, while his suggestion that she transfer to an quote 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 unquote quote unquote quote unquote 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 quote unquote 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 quote unquote 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 a use explicit racial discrimination was a doubt to believe lively. His attempt to cover up the incident by suggesting donation-funded diversity training revealed a pattern of treating civil rights violations as problems that could be solved with money rather than accountability. Dr. Patricia Sanders, the district superintendent, found herself under investigation for failing to address documented patterns of discrimination despite having received complaints from multiple sources over several years. Her office's records showed that complaints involving students or faculty of color were consistently dismissed as personality conflicts or cultural misunderstandings, while similar complaints from white families received immediate attention and action. The financial implications for Lincoln High School District became clear when federal investigators announced that they were considering removing the district's eligibility for federal funding pending resolution of the civil rights violations. This potential loss of millions of dollars in funding created panic among school board members, who suddenly discovered urgent concerns about discrimination that they'd previously ignored. Angela watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. While she was gratified to see accountability finally arriving, she also understood that the community was being forced to confront ugly truths about itself that many people would have preferred to keep hidden. The investigation had revealed that Lincoln High's problems weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of a much deeper disease. The breakthrough moment came when Emma Rodriguez, the student who'd originally recorded Jake's attack for social media entertainment, approached Angela with additional evidence that she'd been reluctant to share. Emma had been filming regularly in classes and hallways, accumulating hours of footage that documented discriminatory behavior by students, faculty, and administrators. "I thought it was funny at first," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you'd just quit like Mrs. Washington did, and we could all go back to normal. But watching the investigation, seeing how serious this is, I realized that what we were doing was really wrong." Emma's footage provided investigators with a comprehensive view of Lincoln High's discriminatory culture that went far beyond isolated incidents. They could see patterns of behavior, consistency in who was targeted and who was protected, and clear evidence of administrative knowledge and complicity. The video evidence was so extensive that federal prosecutors began considering RICO charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights. The community pressure on the Mitchell family intensified as more evidence emerged about Jake's behavior. Local businesses began distancing themselves from Mitchell Construction, recognizing that association with a family defending racial harassment could damage their own reputations. The company lost several major contracts as clients decided they couldn't risk being connected to the controversy. Jake himself became increasingly isolated as former friends and supporters abandoned him. The social hierarchy that had protected him for years crumbled under external scrutiny, leaving him exposed to consequences he'd never imagined possible. His college recruitment prospects evaporated as universities learned about the federal investigation, and his family's lawyers began discussing plea agreements rather than trials. The turning point came when Coach Steve Martinez, the gym teacher who'd initially stayed neutral, approached Angela with information that would prove decisive. Steve had been documenting concerning behavior for years, but had been reluctant to speak up because of his own precarious position as a Latino educator in a predominantly white institution. "I've got security footage from the gym and locker rooms that shows systematic harassment of students of color going back 3 years, Steve told Angela during a private meeting. "I saved it because I knew someday someone would need proof, but I was too scared to use it until now." The footage Steve provided was devastating. It showed Jake and his friends targeting students based on race, using locker room settings to engage in harassment they knew wouldn't be recorded by classroom cameras. It also showed other athletes participating in or witnessing the harassment without intervening, creating a hostile environment for any student who didn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. More importantly, the footage showed coaches and administrators who were clearly aware of the harassment, but chose to ignore it rather than risk conflict with influential families. The failure to protect students created liability for the district that extended far beyond Angela's individual case, potentially affecting every student who'd been subjected to discriminatory treatment. As winter break approached, the federal investigation had expanded to encompass nearly every aspect of Lincoln High's operations. Investigators were examining hiring practices, disciplinary policies, academic tracking systems, and resource allocation to determine whether discrimination was embedded in the institution's fundamental structures. The preliminary findings were damning. Students of color were disproportionately suspended for behavior that resulted in warnings for white students. Advanced courses had enrollment patterns that couldn't be explained by academic performance alone. Faculty positions were filled through networks that consistently excluded diverse candidates, and when diverse educators were hired, they faced working conditions that encouraged turnover. Angela spent her winter break working with investigators and attorneys to prepare for the next phase of the legal process. The Department of Education had already issued preliminary findings that Lincoln High had violated federal civil rights laws, and the district was facing a consent decree that would place it under federal oversight for a minimum of 5 years. The financial implications were staggering. The district faced potential penalties in the millions of dollars, plus the costs of implementing comprehensive reform programs, hiring independent monitors, and providing compensation to victims of discrimination. Several insurance companies had already denied coverage for civil rights violations, leaving the district personally liable for damages that could exceed their total annual budget. But for Angela, the most meaningful development was the transformation she witnessed in students who'd found their voices during the investigation process. Young people who'd been taught to accept discrimination as normal were learning to demand better treatment, both for themselves and for others. The investigation had created a space for conversations about justice, dignity, and human rights that would continue long after federal oversight ended. When classes resumed in January, Lincoln High looked very different. Principal Hayes had been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the investigation, replaced by an interim administrator who'd been brought in specifically to implement civil rights reforms. Jake Mitchell had been expelled and was facing criminal charges as an adult since his 18th birthday had moved him out of juvenile jurisdiction. Several other students who'd participated in harassment campaigns had been suspended or transferred, while faculty members who'd enabled discriminatory behavior were undergoing mandatory training or had chosen to seek employment elsewhere. The changes created space for voices that had been marginalized for years to finally be heard and respected. Angela returned to her classroom to find it transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The same inspirational quotes hung on the walls, the same literature filled the bookshelves, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Students entered respectfully, engaged seriously with the curriculum, and treated each other with dignity that hadn't existed before the investigation. "Good morning, everyone," she said on that first day back, looking around at faces that reflected greater diversity than she'd seen in her first semester. The administration's recruitment efforts were finally focusing on creating truly inclusive environments rather than just checking demographic boxes. Emma Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Thompson, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Emma. How did you know that fighting back would work? Weren't you scared that you'd just make things worse for yourself?" Angela considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence how these students approached injustice in their own lives. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I realized that accepting mistreatment doesn't actually make you safer. It just teaches people that they can abuse you without consequences. Sometimes fighting back is the only way to create the safety and respect you deserve." The conversation that followed revealed how profoundly the investigation had affected students' understanding of power, justice, and their own agency. They discussed literature and life with a sophistication that came from witnessing real-world applications of the themes they studied in books. They'd seen that individuals could challenge institutional injustice, and that courage could create change even when the odds seemed overwhelming. As Angela looked around her classroom at students who were learning to be critical thinkers, effective communicators, and agents of positive change, she understood that her victory had significance far beyond personal vindication. She demonstrated that excellence and integrity could triumph over privilege and prejudice, that documentation and persistence could overcome institutional protection of discrimination, and that standing up to bullies, whether individual students or entire systems, was not only possible, but necessary. The legal proceedings continued for months, with Jake Mitchell ultimately pleading guilty to federal hate crime charges and accepting a sentence that included jail time, community service, and mandatory counseling. His family's construction company lost its federal contracts and faced a civil lawsuit from the Department of Justice for employment discrimination. Principal Hayes was fired and lost his administrative license, while Superintendent Sanders was forced to resign in disgrace. But the most lasting change was cultural. Lincoln High became a model for how educational institutions could address discrimination proactively rather than reactively, how they could create environments where all students and faculty felt valued and protected. The federal oversight program became a template for similar interventions across the country, with Angela serving as a consultant for other districts facing civil rights challenges. 2 years later, Angela stood before a congressional subcommittee on education equity, sharing her story with lawmakers who were drafting federal legislation to strengthen protections for educators facing discrimination. Her testimony was broadcast live, reaching millions of people who needed to hear that fighting injustice was possible and necessary. What began with one student's racist attack in my classroom became a federal investigation that transformed an entire school district, she told the committee. But the real victory wasn't the legal settlements or the policy changes. It was watching students learn that they had the power to demand dignity and respect, that they didn't have to accept discrimination as the price of education. She paused, thinking about all the teachers of color who'd been driven from their positions before they could fight back, and about the students who'd learned to internalize discrimination as normal. Every educator deserves to work in an environment free from harassment and bias. Every student deserves to learn in a place where their identity is respected and their potential is nurtured. These aren't unrealistic expectations. They're basic human rights that we must be willing to defend. The committee room erupted in applause. But Angela was thinking about her current students back in Ohio, young people who were growing up with a different understanding of justice and accountability than previous generations had known. They'd witnessed the power of documentation, the importance of allies, and the effectiveness of systematic resistance to institutional discrimination. As she left the Capitol building that evening, Angela received a text message from Emma Rodriguez, who is now a sophomore at Ohio State University studying journalism with a focus on civil rights reporting. "Watching your testimony on C-SPAN," Emma wrote, "thank you for teaching me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're scared. I'm planning to spend my career making sure stories like yours get told." Angela smiled, understanding that her victory had rippled far beyond Lincoln High School. Students who'd witnessed her stand against injustice were carrying those lessons into their own lives and careers, becoming the next generation of advocates for equality and human dignity. The young people who'd once thought discrimination was acceptable had learned to recognize and challenge bias wherever they encountered it. The transformation wasn't complete. Systemic change was a long, ongoing process that required constant vigilance and commitment. But Angela had proven that individual courage could catalyze institutional reform, that documentation and persistence could overcome entrenched prejudice, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was simply refusing to be silent. Her karate training had taught her that the strongest martial artists weren't those who sought out fights, but those who stood their ground when confronted with aggression. In room 237 at Lincoln High School, she'd found herself in exactly that situation, facing an attack designed to destroy her dignity and drive her away. Her response had been swift, precise, and devastatingly effective, not because she'd used physical force, but because she'd employed the mental discipline and strategic thinking that true martial arts training provided. The kick that had shattered the classroom door wasn't an act of violence, but a demonstration of power controlled and precisely applied. Like everything else in Angela's response to discrimination, it had been calculated to send a clear message. Some people cannot be intimidated, some principles will not be compromised, and some fights are worth having regardless of the personal cost. Jake Mitchell had called her weak during that first roll call, assuming that her patience and professionalism indicated vulnerability. He'd discovered, like bullies throughout history, that the strongest people often appeared gentle until pushed beyond reasonable limits. When that moment came, Angela's response had been as swift and decisive as any martial arts technique, dismantling his assumptions and exposing the institutional corruption that had protected his behavior for years. Now, as she prepared for the next day's classes at Lincoln High, a school that had been fundamentally transformed by her refusal to accept discrimination, Angela understood that her greatest victory wasn't the legal settlements or the policy changes, or even the careers she'd ended. It was the knowledge that a new generation of students was learning that justice was possible, that courage could triumph over hatred, and that sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the pages of textbooks. The bullies had thought they could break her, but they'd only succeeded in revealing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. They'd called her weak, but she'd shown them the difference between kindness and vulnerability, between patience and passivity, between being peaceful and being powerless. In doing so, she'd not only transformed Lincoln High School, but had helped transform the broader conversation about discrimination in education, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against institutional injustice was simply one person's refusal to be silenced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.